Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about getting hired by a dentist and some of the things that are allowed in that hiring process, and then we'll go from there. When you try to get a job, there's a lot of ways that you can do it. I think the classified advertising thing is a little outdated. That's kind of the newspaper. I know many of you probably have never even used a newspaper. Back in the good old days we did. And I'd never really seen this before until the pandemic. But over the course of the last couple years, I have seen mailers sent out, asking for hygienists to apply to their positions. And the reason why is because they're in such a demand right now, which is great news for you, that hopefully when you graduate, you will be able to get a job quickly and even be selective in who you decide to work for. Dentists are trying to make themselves a place that you want to work. So they're offering things like sign-in bonuses, insurance, things like that. Another thing is job placement services. We're going to have CAD come talk to us in a couple years. I don't even remember what that stands for, but they're a big job placement service. And there's several of them around the DFW area. Word of mouth and networking. One of the really great reasons that I've found being involved with TDHA, ADHA is being able to meet other hygienists. And when a job position opens up, we have these group chats and says, does anybody looking for a job? Does anybody know anybody? So, not only attending CE events, but, getting to know some of the people around you instead of just sticking with yourself, try to meet and, get to know other hygienists. Electronic postings and social media. That's a big one. There's specific Facebook pages that are there that people will put out, I'm looking for a temp these days, or we're hiring, so if I knew, I can't even remember, I'm on so many dental hygiene boards on Facebook, but if you really want to know, you could ask me and I could find those for you. So one thing that I want you to know is the interview process usually involves a face-to-face visit where you meet and kind of discuss what your goals are, what their goals are, kind of see if they align. And if they do, they usually call you back for a working visit. And I've seen that where they have you come for a whole day. I've seen it where they'll have you come for 4 hours. I've even had it where they've had you do a couple of hours. Now, one thing that you should be aware of is a working interview should be paid. I actually had a situation where I interviewed with this guy. Well, let me say this. I put in my resume for this guy, and he said he didn't even do the interview process. So he didn't even reach out and do that interview. But instead, he said, can you come do a working interview? Now, I thought that was a little weird. I thought, but maybe we'll kind of interview at the beginning, whatever. So I went to the working interview, and there were like back-to-back scaling and root planings. And those bring in a lot of money, right, for the office. And then at the end of the day, I said, so are you going to mail me that check, or, are you going to pay me right now? And he's like, oh, I'm not paying you. I said, what? I didn't come here to offer free labor. I was livid. And I said, no, you need to pay me for my time. I said, I just did $2,000 of work for you or whatever. And yeah, I expect to get paid for it. Eventually, he did end up paying me. But nowadays, I've heard a few times when people have done that and people just smear them all over the social media. So, dentists should not be doing that, and if they do, their name will kind of probably be known. That being said, it is kind of nice to clarify that ahead of time. I have heard that they are required to pay you, but they don't necessarily have to pay you a hygienist wage. So they might say, well, I'll pay you $15 an hour. And at that point, you're like, yeah, not really worth my time. And if that's the kind of office you are, I don't think I want to work for you, right? It does get a little awkward as well because you're trying to get this job and you're trying to, put off a good impression. But honestly, if you start seeing some red flags like that, you might want to just keep on looking. And fortunately, like I said, in today's setting, you are able to do that, right? I mean, you can be a little choosy. So I always, initially when I first graduated, I'm like, oh, it's me being interviewed. But the further along I got my career, I realized that the interview was not only for them to interview me, but for me to interview them and see if it's a place that I want to work. So usually at the end of the interview, they'll say, do you have any questions? And it's important for you to ask questions that are important to you. How long are you giving for a pro fee? If you start hearing 30 minutes, then, there's your red flags again. Some of you may not want to do assisted hygiene. So, it's good to establish those things. They usually recommend that you don't ask about pay at that first visit. And you do your working interview and then maybe kind of discuss it at that point. So that's kind of one thing that I've heard that is taboo. Now, CAD, when they come, she's going to give us a lot of tips and things that can be really specific to what is appropriate nowadays. I honestly haven't applied for a hygiene position for 5 or 6 years, and it's changed a lot. When you go to the interview, it's important to come prepared. And so we're also going to practice, interview questions kind of coming up. You love that good question of what's your biggest strength? What's your biggest weakness? Kind of coming prepared so you know how to handle those things. You want to make sure you're understanding the job description and maybe even find out a little bit about the practice. Is it mostly families? Is it elderly? Is it low income? So you kind of understand the population you're working with. Okay, so let's talk about, now this is kind of interesting because there are certain things that dentists are not supposed to ask you in an interview. So first of all, let's talk about things that they can ask you, and then we'll talk about things that they cannot. So one of the things they can ask you is your name. They can ask where you've worked before, date of birth. Now, which is kind of interesting to me that they can ask you that, because that could lead to some discrimination if you're too old or too young or what have you. But anyways, they can ask you your date of birth, how long you've lived in a city or state, names of relatives already employed by the employer. Obviously, in a dentist's office, those are kind of smaller usually, and they would probably know that. But there are some bigger nationwide companies where maybe you have a family member in another state. The ability to perform the duties of the position with or without accommodation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that Disabilities Act in a minute. The ability to meet specific work schedules and attendance requirements. So they can't ask you, are you sick all the time? Are you, do you have I guess they shouldn't say, do you have an illness that's going to have to make you miss work? They can't ask you specific like that, but they can say, how many days of work have you missed in the last year, or something to that effect. U.S. citizenship or legal residency status, languages that can be fluently spoken and written. And when we get to the things where questions they cannot ask, what you'll learn is they can't say what's your native language, but they can ask you what languages you speak. And sometimes that can really work to your benefit. I know a lot of you are bilingual, which is great. Education and employment history, criminal conviction history. So remember we talked about criminal cases. So if you were actually convicted of a crime where you have a criminal crime conviction, then they can ask that about you. Now, we'll talk about what they can't ask you in a minute, and then an emergency contact. So these are some things that they cannot ask you. Now, they can ask you your age, but here again, they were just able to ask you your date of birth. So Yeah, a little math, you could figure that out. Your original name, if it was changed, your marital and family status. So this was always kind of super tricky for me in Utah. There were a lot of dentists that kind of want to know, are you going to get pregnant right away? Are you, am I expecting a maternity leave soon? And though they were not able to ask that, I found dentists asking that in a roundabout way. So tell me about your family. Are you married? Do you have kids? Those kind of things. And on one hand, you're kind of feeling like, oh, this is just chit chat, getting to know each other. But the reality is they really shouldn't be asking those questions. And it puts you in a hard position because say you are planning on getting pregnant, within 6 months, it makes it very difficult for you to be honest and feel like, am I compromising getting this job, right? Number of children, their ages or related questions, similar idea. Gender, so, this all male, female, non-binary, whatever. National origin, ancestry, and descent. And then religion. And then we have more. The race or your color of your skin, height or weight. Can you imagine if they had on the application, you have to put down your height and weight? It'd be like, no, thank you. But you know why all these are on here is because people have been discriminated for these things before, which is really sad, right? Your disability status. Once again, they can ask if you're able to perform the job, but they can't get into like what kind of disabilities you have. So similarly, arrest record. They can't ask you if you've been arrested, but if you've actually been convicted of a crime, then, they can ask you that. But if you were never convicted, they can't ask that. List of affiliations and memberships, garnishment of wages, and your native language. Okay. So a lot of times when you start your job, if they are a good employer, they will have you sign a contract, and the contract can be at will. And what that means is basically at any point they could fire you or you could leave the job. And if you do decide to leave, or if they fire you or what have you, they don't have to give you pay. They don't have to tell you why. They could just say, yep, this isn't really working out, right? Some positions that I've been hired with will tell me, we're going to start this. We're going to have a 3-month at-will contract where we can both try each other out. And if it seems like a nice fit, we can change that to a term contract. So a term contract covers specific duration. It cannot be terminated without cause. So if they say we're under a 1-year contract or what have you, you can't terminate it. And if they do decide to terminate it, it has to be a just cause. So, not showing up for your position, fraud, whatever, that kind of thing. Okay, let's stop there and we'll come back for our next slide, kind of talking about some employment laws.